The man who started the First World War was sailing in the middle of the Baltic Sea, smiling. He thought he was sealing an alliance. In reality, he was lighting the fuse. In Vienna, a secret clock was ticking down to a European inferno, and two heads of state, one a king, one a president, were about to guarantee its explosion. Summer 1914. An immaculate French warship, named simply France, cut a slow, majestic furrow through the Baltic silver light. The air in Europe was thick with the possibility of war. Yet all eyes were fixed on the Russian Imperial Navy rendezvous in Kronstadt. Maurice Paléologue, the French ambassador to St. Petersburg, remembered the scene vividly. A prodigious din in the harbour as the guns fired in salute, the crews cheering, and the sound of the Russian national anthem carried across the waves. The mighty warship had delivered the head of the French state, President Raymond Poincaré, to Russia. The Tsar, Nicholas II, received him at the gangway. This was not a social visit. This was the countdown to war. The mission was the final, tense confirmation of the alliance between the largest autocracy in Europe and the continent's only significant republic. This alliance was the foundation upon which France hoped to survive the growing power of Germany. Its renewal now, in the immediate wake of the Archduke's assassination, sent a clear, thunderous message to Berlin and Vienna. The alliance held. For decades, the French Republic had lived in the shadow of the German Empire. Since the catastrophic defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, France had lost not only its emperor, but also its prestige and the territory of Alsace and Lorraine. It was a nation haunted. Raymond Poincaré, a powerful lawyer and politician, was the very embodiment of this national trauma. He hailed from Lorraine. His family had fled west when the German forces occupied his hometown. He had stated, "I saw no other reason to live than the possibility of recovering our lost provinces." As president, he drove French policy with a singular, resolute focus: the restoration of French power. This meant binding the Russians to France with iron chains of commitment. France was smaller than Germany, its population in decline, yet it had maintained parity by militarizing its society. The 3-year law extended military service, boosting French troop levels. The alliance was now bound with iron, driven by a shared fear. But for Germany, this wasn't just a political problem. It was a literal timetable for invasion. If France moved, Germany would be forced to gamble everything on a plan that guaranteed a world war. The French knew that without a massive Eastern ally, they were doomed. The Franco-Russian alliance, first signed in 1894, was celebrated as a necessary counterweight to the new, energetic German Empire. This alliance was expensive. French loans poured into Russia, targeting its military, modernization, and its extensive railway network, a crucial investment designed to ensure that if war came, the Tsar's vast army could mobilize quickly and crash into Germany's eastern flank. Russia, however, had no meek junior partner. It was a rapidly modernizing giant. Its population stood at over 164 million, making its army the largest in the world. Since the Russo-Japanese War, Tsar Nicholas II, an autocrat, had been forced to turn his focus towards Europe and the Balkans. This shift in focus was driven by two core necessities, one of prestige and one of survival. Twice, as the Russians saw it, they had been forced to back down in the Balkans, once when Austria annexed Bosnia, and again during the Balkan Wars. These diplomatic defeats had wounded Russian honor. They learned a painful lesson. The Austrians and Germans saw Russian hesitation as weakness. Moscow believed that if they backed down a third time, Russia would forfeit its claim to great power status forever. Russia had learned a final, dangerous lesson. The Austrians believed they would always back down. This time, Moscow was committed to a strategy that meant any perceived weakness would be met with an unyielding, disastrous strength. But the true engine of Russia's commitment was a cold, hard strategy concerning the fate of the Black Sea Straits. The real reason Russia was willing to risk everything lay 500 miles south, at a narrow waterway that controlled the lifeblood of its economy. This choke point was the Black Sea Straits, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, controlled by the decaying Ottoman Empire. These waterways were the link between Russia's interior ports and the open Mediterranean, and therefore the world. Russia's economic stability depended upon the export of grain, and if those straits were closed, the Russian economy would be in terrible trouble. The foreign minister, Sergei Sazonov, a nervous, highly strung man who looked like a bank manager but held an imperial vision, understood this strategic vulnerability better than anyone. It was his greatest fear that a hostile power would gain control of the straits. His fear was not abstract. It was cemented by the sight of the Ottoman Empire beginning to stage a naval comeback. The Ottomans had just ordered 2 powerful dreadnoughts from a British firm, with 5 more to follow. The Russians had no equivalent dreadnoughts in the Black Sea. Sazonov saw the danger clearly. If those Ottoman ships arrived, the Russian fleet would be outnumbered 6-1, and the chance of taking control of the straits would be torpedoed forever. That sense of urgency was the ticking clock in Russia's foreign policy. Therefore, the Balkans, being the hinterland to the straits, became critically important. Russia needed client states there to guarantee that no enemy power, specifically Austria-Hungary, could control the approach and, by extension, the straits themselves. Russia had pinned its hopes on the rapidly growing Kingdom of Serbia. The Russians could not afford to back down a third time. To do so would mean losing all their authority forever. As Sazonov saw it, the current crisis was not about an assassination, but a final test of wills. His own narrative was one of pure aggression from the opposing side. He dismissed the Archduke's murder as irrelevant. He insisted the assassination was merely a pretext for Austria, acting as the puppet of the German generals, to attack and erase Serbia from the map. Sazonov's view of continental politics was Darwinian. Austria was finished, while Serbia was a younger, more vital nation on a historical mission. For Austria-Hungary to resist this course was illegitimate. Therefore, Sazonov was psychologically primed for conflict, convinced that a hard line was the only line to take. The French visit confirmed his existing assumptions. Maurice Paléologue, the dramatic French ambassador, egged Sazonov on, assuring him that France would stand firm. Sazonov now had the assurance of his one great European ally. He was confident that when the ultimatum came, and he knew it was coming, Russia would have to meet it with the utmost resolve. He met Count Chapery, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador, and immediately went on the offensive, forgoing condolences to warn the diplomat against any attempt to frame the Serbs. Serbia has friends, Poincaré reminded him, and they are watching. This was the French president personally delivering an ultimatum to the Austrians. Go too far, and you will face us. This was exactly what the Russians wanted to hear. The final meeting, a military gala held the night before Poincaré's departure, sealed the deal. Among the guests were 2 Montenegrin princesses, loudly declaring the coming war. Have a war, crack on, Alsace-Lorraine back, we will meet in Berlin. The core message was clear. There would be no turning back. He put the decision into stark terms, warning his colleagues that if Austria attacked Serbia, there will be a world inferno. The Russians had given the Serbians a clear signal: stand firm, and we will stand by you. They had, in effect, given Belgrade a blank check of their own. Poincaré and his Prime Minister, René Viviani, set sail aboard France, confident that their united front with Russia was so overwhelming that the Germans and Austrians would be forced to blink. They were about to find out that the stakes were far higher. But even as the French ships sailed away and the Russians began to weigh their options, the conspirators in Vienna acted. They had waited until their enemies were diplomatically isolated at sea, giving the French and Russians virtually no time to coordinate a response. The timing was crucial, calculated to ensure maximum shock and minimum chance of an organized, unified reply. If you want to understand the incredible tension and the fatal calculations that led Europe to war, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the battles and decisions that shaped our world. The warships were gone. The diplomats were sailing home. With the French back at sea, the clock started ticking. At 6 o'clock post, meridian on a Thursday evening, the gates of the Austrian legation in Belgrade swung open, and the opening move of a global catastrophe was delivered. The timing was deliberate. 7 hours after the French president had steamed out of Kronstadt harbor, the ultimatum was delivered to the stunned Serbian government. Because the Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, was away, the only person available to receive the Austrian ambassador, Baron Giesel von Gieslingen, was the finance minister. He did not speak French. They had to drag in a translator. When the finance minister was given the document, he hesitated, reluctant to touch the paper, as if it were radioactive. Giesel, wearing his traveling clothes, stood firm. "You have 48 hours, he stated. "If you do not answer, I will sever diplomatic relations and leave Belgrade immediately." The ultimatum itself was a masterpiece of aggression disguised as inquiry. It began by correctly stating that Serbian tolerance of anti-Austrian groups had allowed the assassins to carry out their plot. Then came 10 demands, but the finality lay in 2 points that struck directly at the heart of Serbian sovereignty. Point 5 stated that Austria must be allowed collaboration on your soil. Point 6 demanded that Austrian investigators be allowed to take part in the investigations. This was no mere demand for justice. It was a demand for internal submission. As Winston Churchill would later write, it was the most insolent document of its kind ever devised. For the Serbians, accepting Austrian investigators meant allowing them access to the dark underbelly of Belgrade's military intelligence, an impossible demand designed to be refused. The reaction in Belgrade was panic. Prime Minister Pasic, away on the campaign trail, was immediately thrown into a terrible funk. His train had to be stopped by a station master who delivered an urgent note. He had to return and deal with the ultimatum. The Serbian ministers worked frantically through the night. This panic led to an extraordinary moment. Vazar Jankovic, the trade minister, whose family was on holiday in Austrian territory, decided to go to the German embassy to ask for safe passage. In the confusion, his coachman took him to the wrong building, the Austrian embassy. Jankovic arrived just an hour before the deadline. The Austrian ambassador, seeing a Serbian official, assumed he had come with a final plea. Jankovic was ushered inside before realizing his terrible error. He was forced to explain his private situation. Baron Giesel displaying a moment of old-world chivalry, promised as a gentleman to ensure Yankovic's family would be given special passports. This moment of human kindness confirmed my absolute lack of hope. The ambassador was wearing his traveling clothes, and the embassy was packed up and ready for war. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, Sazonov received the news of the ultimatum. It was, he declared to the Tsar, a European war. He immediately blamed Germany. Tsar Nicholas II was unconvinced, pointing out that his cousin, Willy, led a rich nation. Why would they risk everything? But Sazonov was adamant. Russia had tolerated German-Austrian aggression for too long. They must not back down now. We live in an age of instant communication, but back then, every moment of silence added to the terror. If you find this breakdown of the diplomatic failures compelling, please share this video with someone else who loves history. As the 48-hour deadline drew to a close, all eyes turned to Russia. The Serbians had already made their plea, and the French were still at sea, isolated. The fate of the small nation was now in the hands of the autocratic giant. While the states of the continent scrambled to mobilize, one powerful nation stood apart. Britain, master of the sea and the largest empire on earth, watched the gathering storm, its strategy paralyzed by a question no one could answer. Was it an ally or an honest broker? For decades, Britain had enjoyed a policy of splendid isolation, relying on its powerful Royal Navy. But as German power grew, Britain signed the Entente Cordiale with France and a convention with Russia. The resulting ambiguity was fatal. The man in charge of British foreign policy was Sir Edward Grey, a melancholy, high-born politician, far more devoted to fly fishing than to diplomacy. Grey, who spoke no French, was the ultimate honest broker. He genuinely believed that the civilized leaders of Europe could be brought together to see sense. But Grey was an honest broker with a secret. When the French pressed him, he privately assured them, "We'll always stand with you." He never put this promise in writing, allowing him to publicly maintain that Britain was absolutely not bound to fight. This fatal ambiguity misled everyone. It allowed the French and Russians to count on British intervention, and it allowed the Germans to hope that Britain would remain neutral. When Grey read the Austrian ultimatum to his cabinet, he was genuinely shocked, calling it the most formidable declaration he had ever seen. The cabinet was clear. They did not want war. Their initial position was sympathetic to Austria, believing the Serbs needed a damn good thrashing, but they were alarmed by the sheer brutality of the Austrian approach. Grey's immediate solution was to propose a four-power mediation: Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, to pressure Austria and Russia to back down. He was convinced that the Germans and Russians would agree to a civilized conference. But this mediation was flawed. Neither France nor Germany wanted mediation. They wanted a victory of nerves. The proposed lineup would have inevitably voted 3-1 against Austria. While Grey clung to the hope of fishing peacefully on the River Itchen, his diplomats saw the looming disaster. The chief voice of warning was Sir Eyre Crowe, a fanatically anti-German Mandarin. Crowe was the voice of realpolitik, and he laid out the terrible truth in a memo that cut through Grey's idealism. Crowe argued that Britain had no choice but to fight. If Britain stayed out, there were two catastrophic outcomes. Either the Germans won and dominated Europe, leaving Britain alone and friendless at the mercy of the Prussians, or the French and Russians won without British help and would despise us for not having helped them, then turning on Britain. Crowe's prophecy was devastating. The logic of our policy has left us here. We should get stuck in. Britain's only true course was not to mediate, but to fight. The German ambassador in London, Prince Lichnowsky, did his best to reassure Grey that Germany and Austria would see sense. But Lichnowsky's love of Britain was his flaw. He consistently told Grey what they both wanted to believe. Meanwhile, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, in Berlin, rejected Grey's mediation proposal outright, demanding to know why Germany should betray its only friend in Europe. Do you agree with Sir Eyre Crow's ruthless assessment? Let us know in the comments below whether you think Britain had a choice but to fight. As the 48 hours expired, the attention of the world shifted back to the Balkans and St. Petersburg. The Serbians had a reply, and their ally, the Russian giant, had a decision to make. That decision, born of necessity and fear, would prove the final, unplayable hand. The deadline arrived. The final scribbled note was delivered. On the River Itchen, the Foreign Secretary cast a fly while in Tsarskoe Selo, the Tsar donned his guard's uniform, forced to make a decision that would either save a continent or doom it to apocalypse. At 5 minutes to 6 o'clock, post-meridian, Prime Minister Pasic of Serbia arrived at the Austrian legation with the reply. The document was a masterpiece of diplomatic deception. It seemed to accept every single Austrian demand, but in reality, it nullified them all with careful caveats. For example, the Serbians agreed to act against terrorist groups only insofar as it is commensurate with international law. Baron Giesel read the reply and wrote later that nearly all our demands were twisted, robbed of their meaning and purpose. He had no further instructions. He had nothing to weigh or decide. He burned the ciphers, locked the embassy, and within 10 minutes was on a train crossing the bridge into Austro-Hungarian territory. Diplomatic relations were severed. The news was received in Vienna with genuine excitement. Huge crowds gathered outside the War Ministry, celebrating what they believed would be a small, punitive, but glorious Balkan War. The Archduke's assassination was avenged. Emperor Franz Joseph, waiting at his summer home, was told the news. The aged monarch remained quiet and still, offering only the simple, chilling phrase, "Alsdan," or, "Well, then there it is." The real disaster, however, unfolded in Russia. That Saturday, Tsar Nicholas II met his ministers. Sazonov was adamant they must act. They had backed down twice. A third time meant ruin. They decided on the big gamble to implement a partial mobilization of the Russian army, mobilizing the 4 western military districts. This was not a full declaration of war, but a defensive measure designed to show Austria, and by extension Germany, that Russia was serious. The thinking was that the sheer scale of the Russian army getting underway would be enough to frighten the Austrians into withdrawing their ultimatum. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born of the paranoid certainty that the other side would always blink first. Germany was counting on British neutrality and Russian passivity. Russia was counting on its mobilization being a successful deterrent. The Russian mobilization, even partial, immediately set in motion the knock-on effects for Germany. German military strategy, designed to avoid a simultaneous war on 2 fronts, called for the immediate, overwhelming defeat of France first, before the slow Russian war machine could get up to speed. For the Germans, any Russian mobilization, no matter how limited, was a fatal warning sign. It meant they had to start their own clock. In a few short days, what had started as a Serbian crisis would become a Russian mobilization, which would in turn trigger a German mobilization against Russia, which would, according to Germany's plan, necessitate an invasion of France through neutral Belgium. The gamble had failed. The deterrent had become the trigger. The decision had been made. The point of no return crossed. The states of Europe, tethered together by a mountaineer's rope of defensive alliances and aggressive gambles, were all relying on the belief that the others were bluffing. With the Russian mobilization underway, that rope snapped, and they were ready to vanish over the precipice into the abyss. The siege of Belgrade proved that courage and faith could overcome an empire. But the July crisis proved that paranoia and pride can start a world war. The history of the modern world hinges on this final, fatal week. If you want to dive deeper into the forces that shaped our world, subscribe to our channel now. Until then, we will be back soon with more stories about the incredible battles and decisions that shaped our history.